I'm going to explain the complete process of prepping and staining a piece of furniture. The first step is the most important step, and it requires the most patience, and that's sanding. We want to sand the piece so it feels nice and smooth so it can properly receive the stain. But before you begin sanding, make sure your pieces are clean. I have found it's easier to use a putty knife, multi-tool, or anything sharp to scrape any leftover wood glue off to make sure your surface is clean, because wood glue will not sand. First, you want to get 120 grit sandpaper. 120 grit is the number of grit you want to do a majority of your sanding. Either wrap the paper around a small block of wood or make things a lot easier by attaching it to an electric handheld sander. Run it through the entire piece to remove any scratches or saw marks. The piece should feel pretty even, but not yet perfect. You can also use this grit to round off corners without taking too much off. When sanding edges, it's good to hang the piece over the edge of a table to make things easier for you. Before each time you use a different grit number, always make sure you wipe your wood surface clean. This will prevent the larger leftover sanding grits from scratching the surface. We'll continue to smooth out the smaller imperfections with a second run using a more fine 220 grit. Don't worry about memorizing all the types of sandpaper, because here's a cheat sheet for you to screen cap. When sanding, you always want to start at the lower numbers, then work up. Typically, you only need to use 80 grit sandpaper to plane down large gouges in the wood or to round off corners. The very fine sandpaper grits will be used later in the process as final touch-ups between your protective coats. Once you're done sanding the entire piece with a 220, you should be able to slide your hand across the piece no problem. Before you move on, remove all the sawdust by vacuuming and wiping it clean with a rag. Sometimes I'm lazy and I like to blow dust around. Unless you're working outside, that'll create more work for you later. For the rest of the operation, you want to make sure you're working in a clean, well-lit, well-ventilated area. Before we apply the stain, we're going to use a pre-stained wood conditioner. This is recommended for all woods, but most important for softer woods like pine, cedar, spruce, fir, and any other porous woods. All you need is a cheap brush to apply this. You don't have to worry about overbrushing or underbrushing because this stuff applies very easily. This helps even out the color you're applying to the wood and prevents any blotchiness. It only takes probably 15 minutes to dry, wipe off any excess, and then you're ready to begin staining. This piece is now completely ready to receive the stain. To apply the stain, all you need is a rag. I like to divide an old cotton t-shirt into 5 or 6 individual rags and always have them handy. To apply the stain, you want to simply wipe it in the same direction as the grain. Sometimes wiping perpendicular to the grain helps the stain soak into the fibers of the wood, but you always want the last touch to run parallel to the grain. The more porous a piece of wood is, the more difficult it is to apply stain. You want to focus extra on places like the end of the piece of wood. Those areas will soak up more stain, which requires you to apply more stain. Proper sanding should minimize this issue, but you want to make sure you're really working the stain into the wood fibers on the ends of pieces. If the stain splatters onto the wood, you want to wipe it immediately, otherwise it could leave spots. If your piece has many corners and you're unable to take it apart, it may be easier to use a brush to reach some of these less accessible areas, but use sparingly because brushes tend to apply stain more heavily than rags, so this is why it's best to have your piece disassembled. You want to keep a few extra rags or paper towels close by to wipe off the excess stain for any general cleanup. Once your piece is completely covered, wait at least 4 hours, keeping it in a well-ventilated area before moving on to the next step. Once your project is dry, it is ready to receive its clear protective coat. This will completely seal and protect your project from any moisture, food stains, and will greatly increase the overall durability of the surface. Before you even begin placing it on, it's important to thoroughly stir the polyurethane to get the goop stuff off from the bottom. It's good to use an oil-based conditioner with an oil-based stain, so I typically use a polyurethane, which is an oil-based product as well. To apply this, you'll want to use a fresh, soft brush and apply with long, smooth strokes. Once the polyurethane is placed on the surface, it's a very tacky substance to work with, so avoid overbrushing. It's much easier to work while the most important surfaces are horizontal because it can easily be streaky on vertical surfaces. It's not required, but I recommend applying 3 to 4 coats in high use areas. Think of kitchen tables and coffee tabletops. In areas where it's touched and utilized less, you can get away with probably 2 coats of this. Think of table legs or many vertical surfaces. Once the piece is completely covered, wait 4 hours or overnight before you apply the second coat. If the piece feels pretty rough, most likely it will after the first coat. You'll want to wait 12 hours so the finish is completely dry enough for you to lightly sand it with 320 grit sandpaper. Once it's lightly sanded and cleaned, you're ready to apply the next coat. Repeat this process until you have 3 coats on the high use areas and you're satisfied with the feel of the surface. And congrats, you're now done sanding and finishing your project. I recommend waiting at least 48 hours until you begin touching and placing items on the project. This will give it time to cure. If you enjoyed this, please stay tuned because more content is coming your way. Thanks for watching.